My dear friends and budding historians, our lecture today is an overview of the Renaissance. And if you're in my Western civilization class, you're going to want to go ahead and get out those Renaissance PowerPoint slides. As this lecture is basically, I'm just walking you through the slides and explaining them a little more. So you can have those out right in front of you and just have this listen to it on audio. Okay, the Renaissance. So just to I think you kind of know this already, but the Renaissance was a time of rebirth. So the idea was that Europe was just crappy. It was just, terrible during the Middle Ages, and they were ignorant and they didn't know anything. And that suddenly there's this rebirth where, oh, we have this ancient Greco-Roman heritage, and oh, we can make things and we can do things and create beautiful art and learning and all of that. Okay, that's the idea, and I'm not saying that idea is necessarily true. But there was a rediscovery and a retranslation of things that had been kind of lost to Western Europe. It started in the Crusades, that more information kind of was coming out of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Arabian world after the Crusades. And this had another blossoming in the 1300s because people were trying to get out of the Byzantine Empire as the Turks were coming in closer and closer. In 1453, the Turks finally conquered the capital city of Constantinople, putting an end to the Byzantine Empire. So a lot of people tried to get out of there, including scholars and people who had access to information, texts, and just a lot of learning and education to bring to the West. Okay, it's hard to date the Renaissance because it started earlier in Italy and then it spread northwards, which is why we might call someone from the 1300s in Italy could be categorized as Renaissance. And meanwhile, in England, you have someone like Shakespeare, all the way in the year 1600 is considered Renaissance. So it was just a kind of a slow spread of these humanistic ideals. The ideals they had, the things that they loved, were the classics. So by classics, we mean classical Greece and classical Rome. They loved something called humanism. So there's a term called secular humanism that's thrown around a lot today, and that's different. I want you to know that in the Renaissance, the idea of humanism was very Christian. Very usually the Renaissance thinkers retained a strong Christian faith. Most of them, a few of them were not Christian, but most of them were embedded in the Christian tradition, but they were adding something new to it, which was they wanted to understand the ancients, the Greco-Romans, and they wanted to understand the material world more. What does it mean to be a human? So before, learning was so focused on understanding God, right? That was what it was to understand. And now in the Renaissance, there was a reflection of what does it mean to be a human? What's that all about? And connected with this focus on humanism is a focus on realism. What's reality? Not what's up there, but what's down here. Okay, not to say they're rejecting that, but just that they were focused on the realism as a new field that needed more exploration. Okay, and the Renaissance is also characterized by a lot of patronage of the arts by the elite. So there's this real flourishing of the arts, much more so than in earlier period. Okay, one form that was patronized by elites was literature and writing. The writing becomes a little more based on the real world, so it leads to things like social criticism, and we'll see this in the next next lecture when we talk about Machiavelli. A lot of the writing in the Renaissance tended to use vernacular language, which means the language of the people. So Dante most famously used the language he spoke. And by the way, the language of Dante was adopted by Italy to be their language. So even today, Italian is really basically based on the Tuscan dialect that Dante wrote in. Okay. By and large, the Renaissance kind of left women behind, but not completely. So there were important women thinkers like Christine de Pizan, who wrote about women's points of view and what women were capable of contributing to society. Okay. In sculpture, this for the first time since the ancient Greeks and Romans, suddenly in the Renaissance, there's a return to freestanding sculptures. There's not a ton of freestanding sculptures from the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, sculpture tends to be part of a structure, usually a church. And suddenly there's this flourishing of freestanding sculptures, some of which go into people's homes. There's some beautiful examples there from Donatello at the top. Below that, the bottom picture is Bernini's A Veiled Vestal Virgin. Look at the veil. Look at what he was able to carve from marble. From marble, with a chisel, he makes it look like gauze is over her face. By the way, notice the themes of these different sculptures. So the top sculpture by Donatello, that's St. George, so that's a Christian theme. The bottom theme, a veiled Vestal Virgin, so the Vestal Virgins of the Roman religion. So this is a depiction of an ancient Roman woman who worshipped Vesta, right? So there's this kind of odd mix of Christian and let's say pagan themes, right? The picture on the side is one of Michelangelo's captives, and these are really really interesting sculptures because they seem to show a sculpture that got stopped halfway through making. So we have this energy of this beautiful figure trying to break free from the marble. And when you visit Florence and you go to see the David, make sure to look at the captives who are housed with David. Your image here of Michelangelo's Pietà, apart from being so stunningly beautiful, so perfect, the form of it looks like they could look up at us. It looks like a real person. But I also wanted to include it because I think it really crystallizes what I'm saying about how the Renaissance people did have this interest in what does it mean to be a human. Because we have this moment here of Christ, who is a God, but at his most human, because his human body has died. Right? So even though it's very biblical, it's also a reflection on the material world that we have down here. In painting, we see the same focus on this kind of realistic perfection where things look more rounded, more deep. They look a lot more like photos. They don't look exactly like photos, but they look more and more like photorealistic. One reason why this was able to be achieved in the Renaissance and not before is because only in the Renaissance did a technique of oil painting emerged. Before that, paints were usually mixed with some other kind of base, such as a watercolor tempera or an egg tempera or something like that. All of those things dry very quickly, so you have to work quickly. I don't know if you've worked with watercolors, But if you can remember, as a young person making a painting with watercolors, if you remember what happens if you make a mistake with the watercolor, you can't really paint over it. It's just there, and you try to paint over it and fix it, and it becomes a big blob, and it's just a big ugly mess. You have to, with a watercolor, you kind of have to get it right the first time. With oil paintings, it takes forever to dry. That means you don't have to work fast. And it also means if you make a mistake, or not a mistake, but if you just want to change something, it's still wet, so you can scrape it off if you want to, or you could put more paint on top of it, and it's not gonna, the mistake's not gonna show through. You can layer it on top of it. So you're able to really take your time, make changes, and achieve really perfection. Science, technology, engineering, and math also exploded during this time period, and we'll talk more about that when I present to you the slides about the scientific revolution, which started kind of around the same time, maybe a little later. Typically, people would say the 1500s is the scientific revolution. The outcomes of the Renaissance is that it was the beginning of modernity. Modernity is said to begin around the year 1500s. You can't be too specific with something like when did modernity start, when did the modern era start, but probably roughly around the time that Columbus sailed. That was kind of a really big break in human history. Okay, we see the Renaissance starting before modernity, so it's kind of laying the groundwork of some of the things that we see in modernity. Modernity is a little more secular. Modernity has a lot of focus on learning, a lot of focus on the material world, and a lot of focus on questioning. You know, I'd argue to you that the sign of learning is actually an increase in questions. Okay, so that the more you learn, the less you know, kind of thing. So people who are very learned are always asking questions, and that led to the scientific revolution. And I would argue it led to that age of exploration where people question, what if we tried to sail the wrong direction and see what's out there? And I would argue it even led to the Protestant Reformation that we will talk about very soon, when people questioned whether the church really had the only avenue toward the perfect understanding of the spiritual life. I'll leave you with a historiographical question, which is that, was the Renaissance actually a real thing that happened, or is that just something historians made up? I'll tell you that the term was only popularized in the 1800s. So that was a time when historians were looking back and trying to categorize, oh, when did this time period start? When was that time period start? But your textbook says maybe all the things, you know, that I just spoke about were kind of more of an evolution. It was an evolution of the later ages. And one way you might try and think about this and balance it out is compare the slides I just showed you to last week's slides about the High Middle Ages. Okay, there's so much overlap that you might even start to question, are these two separate topics, or are they just one topic that's spread out over two PowerPoints? We even see some of the same people show up, such as Dante. My point of this last comment and this last slide is to remind you of something we talked about before, which is that history is the product of interpretation, and history is open to interpretation. And that's part of something called historiography, which is understanding some historians interpreted it this way and some historians interpreted it this way. Thank you so much for joining me today.